The most quoted lines of Psalm 139 are beautiful and safe. You have searched me and known me. Where can I go from your spirit? I am fearfully and wonderfully made. These verses are printed on greeting cards, embroidered on pillows, recited at funerals. But the psalm does not end there. It ends with a prayer for God to kill the wicked. And by the time you reach that verse, the entire psalm has been engineered to lead you there. Read it again, and you will find that the peaceful opening and the violent ending are not opposites. They are the same argument moving through different rooms of the same house. The word the psalmist uses in verse 1 is chakar, which means far more than surface-level searching. Chakar is to dig, to mine, to examine with the exhaustive care of someone sifting through rubble for a single coin. In Job, God uses the same word when he challenges Job. Can you search out the deep things of God? The implication is that human searching is partial, but divine searching is total. God does not skim the psalmist's surface. God turns over every layer of the soul until nothing remains hidden. The next verses then expand that image into a geography of inescapable presence, height, depth, darkness, light, the far side of the sea. There is nowhere the psalmist can go where God is not already there. This is comforting. It is also terrifying. Because if God sees everything, then God sees the worst things. And the psalmist knows that. He does not flinch from it. But then the psalm takes a turn. At verse 19, the poet cries out, "Oh, that you would kill the wicked, O God! Depart from me, you bloodthirsty ones." The shift is jarring. For most readers, this feels like a different psalm altogether, a violent appendage that the lectionary often quietly omits. Yet it is not a separate composition awkwardly attached. It is the logical destination of everything that came before. The God who knows everything, who sees into the depths, also sees the enemies. And the psalmist, fully aware that he is standing in the light of that all-seeing gaze, does not pretend that the enemies do not matter. He does not spiritualize them into interior struggles. He names them. There is a problem here, however. The psalmist has just declared that God knows all his thoughts. If God already knows that the psalmist hates the wicked, why does he need to say it out loud? The answer is not obvious, and the psalm does not answer it immediately. Instead, it pushes deeper into the darkness, and the reader is left sitting with the tension. Consider the prayer itself, "Oh, that you would kill the wicked." The grammar is a wish, not a command. The psalmist is not telling God what to do, he is exposing what he wants. That distinction matters, because the act of exposing a desire to God changes the one who prays. To speak a wish aloud is to release it from the private realm where it festers into the public realm where it can be examined. The psalmist is not hiding his heart from God, he is letting God see it without camouflage. And the reader, who may have similar wishes buried deep, is forced to ask whether they have ever done the same. In the ancient world, the enemy was not an abstract concept. The enemies of the psalmist were real people, those who had slandered him, threatened his life, or opposed the covenant community. The language is visceral daimim, bloodthirsty ones, men of blood. Daimim is the plural of dam, the Hebrew word for blood. It carries the weight of spilled life. These are not political opponents or personal annoyances. They are people whose actions are fundamentally opposed to the God who searches and knows. In a world without police or courts of appeal, the psalmist had no recourse but to cry out to the only judge who could see the truth. His prayer was not a generalized wish for violence. It was the raw expression of a person who had been wounded by evil and who believed that God's justice must eventually show itself. The imprecatory Psalms are not the Bible's embarrassing uncle. They are the Bible's honest recording of what human beings feel when they have been victimized and yet still trust in a God who sees. And that is where the modern reader squirms. We are comfortable with a God who searches us, who knows us, who made us wonderfully. We are not comfortable with a God who hears prayers for the destruction of enemies. But consider the alternative. If the psalmist had censored himself, if he had pretended not to feel the rage, then the psalm would be a lie. The relationship would be incomplete. The person who prays, "Lord, I forgive them," while still carrying a knot of fury in their chest, is not praying honestly. They are performing holiness. The psalmist refuses to perform. He brings the fury raw. He does not say, "Lord, help me to love my enemies." He says, "Lord, they are bloodthirsty and I want you to act." That is not the final word of Christian maturity, but it is the first word, and it is honest. The person who cannot say I hate this to God is also the person who cannot say I forgive to the one who harmed them. Honest hatred, brought into the presence of the God who searches, is the only foundation for honest reconciliation. The next verses only deepen the discomfort. The psalmist declares that he hates those who hate God, that he counts them as his enemies. The language is absolute kalhasset, a perfect hatred. There is no room for nuance. Most readers try to soften this. They say the psalmist is speaking of the enemies of God's people, not personal enemies. But the text does not let us off that easily. The psalmist has woven his own identity so tightly into God's identity that the two have become inseparable. To attack God is to attack him. To oppose God is to oppose him, and he will not pretend otherwise. The modern instinct is to distance ourselves from such identification, to say, I can love the sinner and hate the sin. But the psalmist does not make that distinction. He feels the hatred as a single, unified response, and he brings it to God without refining it first. That is uncomfortable because it is honest. But earlier I raised the question, why does the psalmist need to speak these words if God already knows the heart? The answer begins to emerge in this very intensity. The psalmist is not informing God of something God does not know. He is bringing his own heart into the light. He is acknowledging that the hatred is there, that it is real, that it is burning, and he is not hiding it. That act of honest exposure is what makes the final verses possible. Because if the psalmist had stopped at the beautiful opening, if he had simply basked in the comfort of being known, he would have left a part of himself in the shadows. He would have pretended that the darkness inside him did not exist. And a God who searches all things cannot be in relationship with a person who refuses to be searched all the way. The imprecation is not a departure from the psalm's logic, it is the fulfillment of it. The searching God has now been given everything to search. The psalmist chooses instead to bring the whole mess forward. He stands in the light of God's gaze and says, yes, I hate them. Yes, I want you to act. I am not holy enough to rise above this. I am not mature enough to let it go. I am giving it to you because I cannot carry it. And that is the prayer that the church has often been too embarrassed to pray. But it is the prayer that moves the psalm toward its final movement. The reader who has never prayed like that may wonder whether their own prayers have been short of honesty. The reader who has prayed like that may feel for the first time that the psalm understands them. The psalmist has named his enemies. He has called for their judgment. He has admitted his own visceral revulsion. But the psalm is not finished. It turns back on itself, and the last request is not for them but for himself. And that word search appears again, the same chakar from the very first verse. The psalm has come full circle, but the circle has tightened. The question now is whether the psalmist can stand under that searching gaze after all he has just said, and whether the reader can. The question now is whether the psalmist can stand under that searching gaze after all he has just said, and whether the reader can. The final 5 verses of Psalm 139 are the most overlooked in the entire composition. Having called down judgment on the wicked, having declared a perfect hatred for God's enemies, the psalmist does not walk away satisfied. He turns back to the same God who searched him in the first verse and prays again, search me, O God, and know my heart, test me, and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. The same verb chakar returns search, dig, mine. The same God who knew him before he spoke now hears him invite that searching a second time. But something has changed. The first search was declared, God searched, and God knew. The second search is requested, now the psalmist asks for it. That difference is the entire point of the psalm. The first search was an announcement of fact, God knows everything. The second search is an invitation of trust, God, I want you to know everything. The distance between those two postures is the distance between doctrine and relationship. The imprecation was not a detour. It was the bridge between knowing that God sees everything and wanting God to see everything. The psalmist had to name his hatred out loud because until he did, he was still hiding something. The first half of the psalm says God knows all, theologically true, but experientially incomplete. The psalmist could assent to the doctrine of God's omniscience while still keeping a sealed room in his heart where the rage lived. The act of praying against the enemies forced that sealed room open. He had to bring the ugliness into speech, and only after bringing it into speech could he then sincerely ask God to examine everything else that might be hiding there. The word for anxious thoughts in verse 23 is sop, which literally means divided or divided thoughts, the kind of inner fragmentation that happens when a person is torn between what they feel and what they believe they should feel. The psalmist is asking God to find the places where he is split, where he is not whole. Sop is not a word for ordinary worry. It is a word for the internal civil war that rages when a person hates someone they know they should love, when they want revenge but believe in forgiveness, when they feel rage and shame about the rage simultaneously. That divided state is precisely what the imprecation exposed. By speaking the hatred, the psalmist brought the division into the open so that it could be healed rather than hidden. The ancient audience would have recognized this structure immediately. In the temple liturgy, a person did not approach the altar with a sacrifice while holding unresolved anger. The prophets made that clear: leave your gift at the altar and first be reconciled to your brother. But reconciliation with a brother who had wronged you was not a simple act of pretending the wrong had not happened. It required naming the offense. In the temple courts, a person would bring their sacrifice, but before the priest could offer it, they would have to confess the sin or the grievance that had created distance. The physical act of walking to the altar, handing the animal to the priest, and speaking the words aloud created a sequence that forced honesty. The psalmist is doing something parallel. He brings his anger to God, speaks it fully, and only then asks for purification. He is not pretending the anger is holy. He is insisting that it must be named before it can be transformed. The modern church has often reversed the order. We ask God to cleanse us of anger without first acknowledging that the anger is there. We pray for forgiveness without first saying what we have done or what has been done to us. The psalmist will not make that mistake. He has said the worst thing he feels. Now he is ready to be searched. The reader who has never spoken their hatred to God may wonder why their prayers for peace feel hollow. The psalmist's answer would be that the peace cannot come until the warfare inside has been fully confessed. The final verse brings the psalm to rest on the phrase, the way everlasting. There is a deliberate echo here of the earlier verse, where the psalmist spoke of the wicked as those who speak against God with malice and lift themselves up against God in vain. The wicked have their way, a way of pride and violence. The psalmist asks to be led in the way that is ancient, permanent, the way that has always been. But notice, he does not ask to be removed from the world where the wicked exist. He asks to be led through it. The everlasting way is not a path of escape. It is the path of continued relationship with the God who searches. The psalmist will still face enemies. He will still feel hatred. But he has learned that the only safety is in bringing every layer of himself under the divine gaze. Even the layers he wishes were not there. The reader who expects the psalm to promise a life without conflict will be disappointed. The psalm promises nothing of the kind. It promises a guide who sees every shadow and still walks forward. For the present-day reader, this psalm dismantles two common spiritual errors. The first is the error of spiritual bypassing, pretending that faith means rising above negative emotions. The psalmist proves that faith means dragging those emotions into the presence of God and naming them. The person who says, "I just need to forgive and move on," without ever admitting that they are still furious, is not moving on. They are moving the fury into a deeper room where it will do more damage. The second error is the error of private bitterness, holding on to anger and nursing it in secret until it becomes identity. The psalmist proves that bitterness dissolves when it is exposed to the light of the God who searches. The reader who has prayed the first half of the psalm but skipped the imprecation has not finished the prayer. The reader who has felt hatred and refused to speak it to God has not yet trusted God enough to handle it. Consider what it would mean to actually pray like the psalmist. Not to ask God to remove the anger, but to bring the anger into the prayer and say, "Here it is. It is ugly. It is real. I am giving it to you because I cannot carry it, and I cannot get rid of it on my own." That prayer is terrifying. It is also the only prayer that leads to the final request. The word chakar returns one final time in the last prayer, and it carries the full weight of everything that came before. God digs into the psalmist's soul, not as an intruder but as an invited guest. The digging is welcome now, because the psalmist has already shown God the worst room. The request, "See if there is any grievous way in me," uses the word otseb, which means pain or hurt, not just sin, but the wounded places, the places where the psalmist has been broken by what the enemies did. Outrage appears in Genesis when God speaks to Eve about the pain of childbirth, the sharp, physical, inescapable kind of suffering. The psalmist is not only asking for moral cleansing, he is asking for healing of the wounds that the enemies inflicted, the wounds that made him hate in the first place. The imprecation was not the opposite of forgiveness, it was the acknowledgement that a wound exists, and only a wound that is acknowledged can be healed. The reader who has been wounded and has never prayed about the wound directly may find that their attempts at forgiveness have been hollow because they skip the step of naming the hurt. The psalmist refuses to skip it. The final sentence lands with a weight that the entire psalm has been building: lead me in the way everlasting. The psalmist does not end with certainty about himself. He ends with trust in the one who leads. He does not claim to be pure. He claims to have been searched, and that is enough. The psalm that began with the terrifying knowledge that God sees everything ends with the liberating knowledge that God sees everything and still leads. The reader who has followed the psalmist through the imprecation, through the exposure of hatred, through the request for searching, now stands at the same place. The question is not whether the hatred is gone. The question is whether it has been handed over. The psalm does not promise that the enemies will be destroyed. It promises that the one who prays honestly will be led. And that is the heaviest truth. This passage produces the way everlasting does not begin when the anger ends. It begins when the anger is spoken to the only one who can carry it. The psalmist does not ask for a clean heart as a condition of being led. He asks to be led so that his heart can become clean. The searching is not punishment. It is the path.